Director Vael Ourn had requisitioned a human medical officer for the Cathara transit station the way she requisitioned everything, with a detailed specification list, a clear chain of priority, and the absolute conviction of someone who had spent 22 years navigating coalition bureaucracy and knew precisely what the system owed her. She had asked for certification in emergency trauma response. She had asked for experience with multi-species biological protocols. She had asked, most specifically, for someone who would not draw attention in an environment where 11 different diplomatic delegations were already drawing enough of it on their own. The Coalition Medical Corps had reviewed her request and assigned Corporal Eden Voss. What they had not included, through what the subsequent review board would characterize as an administrative lapse of considerable magnitude, was Corporal Voss's complete personnel file. The document existed. It was correctly filed. It had simply not been attached to the transfer order, which meant that on page 4 under planetary classification, the notation sat unread in a database archive. Earth, Class 12, Deathworld. Ourn met Voss at the transit dock at ZO 700. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have articulated precisely what she had expected. Medium height. Lean in the way of someone whose body had made certain structural decisions over a long period of time and committed to them. Brown hair that suggested he had not prioritized anything about his appearance in some time. He carried a standard-issue medkit and a secondary case whose contents she did not ask about, and he did not volunteer. He read her full operational briefing without asking her to slow down, confirmed his understanding with 3 questions that were brief and specific, and indicated he had retained everything, and then walked beside her through the station's lower corridor with the quality of presence that she would later describe, in her official report, as unremarkable in a way that took effort. She had found him competent. That was the word she used, internally. Competent. The Cathara transit station occupied a processing node at the outer edge of the Vareth corridor, a mid-size installation that the Coalition used primarily for diplomatic transfers, scientific relay, and the specific category of cargo the manifest documentation described as sensitive biological specimens requiring environmental stabilization, and that most personnel with sufficient clearance understood to mean things that required extremely careful handling and were not, under any circumstance, to be encountered outside of their containment parameters. Ourn's assignment occupied the station's Central Coordination Wing. 36 hours of diplomatic processing, 4 medical oversight rotations, and a formal reception that she had been managing the logistics of for 8 weeks. It was the kind of work she had built a career on. She was very good at it. The incident occurred at hour 9, in the lower maintenance junction between the Biological Containment Wing and the station's primary circulation corridor. A Skethavar specimen, a pack predator from the Dureth catalog, the category that the Containment Division's operational documentation classified as coordinated, highly aggressive, environmentally adaptive, had been in transfer from one pressurized holding unit to a secondary isolation chamber when the pneumatic seal on the transfer conduit failed. The failure had been traced later to a microfracture in the conduit joint, a defect that had passed 3 separate inspection cycles, which the post-incident review would spend considerable time examining. What mattered in the immediate moment was that a Skethavar, roughly the length and mass of 2 adult Coalition personnel, laid end to end, with the specific disposition of something that had been in a pressurized tube for 4 hours and had views about that, was now in the maintenance junction between the containment wing and approximately 53 station personnel. There were 2 of them. This detail, which the Containment Division's briefing materials noted but did not emphasize sufficiently, became very relevant very quickly. The station's emergency response team mobilized with practiced efficiency. 3 officers reached the junction entrance in 22 seconds. Containment rods extended, calculating an approach vector that would not result in the specimens moving further into the circulation corridor where 14 of the 11 delegation support staff were currently in transit. The calculation was not converging on a solution at a speed that matched the situation. Eden was in the junction because he had been conducting his second rotation sweep of the lower-level medical posts and had taken the maintenance corridor as a shortcut, which was within protocol. He was 10 meters from the primary specimen when the second one came around the corner of the conduit housing. He stopped. The Skethavar's threat assessment behavior had been documented across 61 observation periods in the Containment Division's records. The sequence was consistent: orient, vocalize, close distance. The interval between vocalization and closing distance had been recorded across all 61 sessions as averaging 1.8 seconds. It did not vary significantly. The species did not have a lengthy threat assessment phase. They had been shaped by an evolutionary environment in which hesitation was a liability, and they had resolved that problem in the most direct way available. The primary specimen oriented toward Eden and vocalized. Then it did not close distance. It stood in the maintenance junction and looked at him. The Containment Division's senior observer, watching the feed from the junction's secondary camera, would note in her incident report that she had, across 11 years of working with Skethavar specimens, never observed the vocalization to contact interval exceed 4 seconds. The interval with the primary specimen oriented toward Eden Voss reached 7 seconds. Then 9, then 12. Eden looked at the specimen in the way of someone taking a professional assessment of a situation that had introduced new variables and was determining the most efficient path to resolution. He did not step backward. He did not step forward. He held the stillness of something that was, in its own right, in the middle of an evaluation. The secondary specimen made a sound from behind the conduit housing, low, questioning. The primary responded with a short vocalization that the Containment Division would later classify, after considerable internal debate, as de-escalatory communication directed not toward its companion, but toward Eden, which was not a category of Skethavar vocalization that existed in their documentation, because Skethavar did not de-escalate. They had never needed to. Then the primary moved, because Skethavar were not animals that arrived at considered conclusions through extended reflection, and Eden met the engagement with the efficiency of someone who had spent years on a planet where the ecosystem had not arranged itself around human comfort, and had consequently developed a thorough working knowledge of how to handle situations that most of the coalition species encountered only in worst-case scenario briefings. The engagement lasted 51 seconds. At the end of 51 seconds, both specimens were subdued. The primary was immobilized with a restraint application from the secondary case whose contents Ourn had not asked about that morning. The secondary specimen had been redirected into a service alcove and contained with a combination of the medkit's emergency barrier foam and what the maintenance junction's damage assessment would later describe as improvised application of the conduit housing's pressure release mechanism, which had not previously been used in that capacity, and which the engineering team would spend some time discussing afterward. Eden was kneeling on the junction floor, with his hand still on the primary specimen's restraint line. He had a deep scoring laceration across his left forearm where the primary's secondary limb had connected, and what the medical assessment would record as significant blunt force contusion to his right shoulder, and a torn section of sleeve, and the expression of someone who had just finished a task and was now moving on to the next one. The emergency response team had not deployed their containment rods. There had been no moment in which doing so would not have introduced additional variables into an already complex situation, and additionally the situation had concluded before a clean deployment window presented itself. Ourn stood at the junction entrance and looked at the scene. 22 years. She had managed extraction operations, 3 station evacuations, a biological contamination event that had required the quarantine of an entire diplomatic wing for 11 days, and a transit negotiation that had, technically, nearly reclassified the station's operating status before she personally intervened at the commissioner level. She had navigated things that most people in her position had only read about in incident archives. She had not seen anything like this. The emergency response lead reached Eden, assessed the junction, and looked at him with the specific quality of a professional who has encountered something that does not fit existing categories and is deciding how to file it. "Origin," he said. Not a question. The phrasing of someone who had already arrived at the answer and was seeking confirmation. "Earth," Eden said. He was checking the restraint tension on the primary specimen with the focus of someone completing a procedure correctly. The response-led's secondary eyelids closed for a brief moment, which in his species indicated the processing of information that required significant cognitive reallocation. Then he opened them and directed his team toward specimen management. Ourn walked to where Eden was standing, which took more deliberate effort than she would have predicted, and looked at him with the specific manner of someone who has been operating from an assessment that has just been substantially revised. "Your file," she said, "did not include your planetary classification." Eden looked at her with the mild expression of someone receiving information they consider factually accurate but not particularly significant. "No," he said. It usually doesn't come up in the transfer documentation. A pause that contained several things Ourn was working through. They assessed you based on your medical certifications, she said. That's what the requisition specified, Eden said. He picked up his med kit and conducted a quick inventory of its remaining contents. I addressed the listed criteria. Ourn looked at the junction, at the 2 subdued specimens, at the scoring marks on the conduit housing, at the section of sleeve on the floor. The primary specimen, she said, did not close distance for 12 seconds. Eden considered this. They're assessing threat level, he said, in the tone of someone explaining something they consider straightforward. Pack predators with coordinated hunting behavior. The primary reads the environment before committing the group. If it encounters something it doesn't have a reference category for, it takes longer. A pause. What reference category did it put you in? Ourn asked. Eden looked at the specimen, which was currently immobilized and breathing in the controlled pattern of something that had been correctly sedated. Probably the same one most things from Earth end up in, he said. Something it wasn't sure it wanted to start a problem with. Another pause, longer. Somewhere in the station, the emergency response team was managing the junction with professional efficiency, and in the circulation corridor above, station staff were explaining to 14 delegations' support personnel that the situation was resolved and that the processing schedule would continue as planned, and there was the specific ambient sound of an installation returning to its operational rhythm after a disruption. The reception, Ourn said, starts in 50 minutes. You need to have that arm looked at. Eden glanced at the laceration with the brief, assessing attention of someone who has been looking at injuries for a long time and has well-calibrated views on which ones require immediate action and which ones represent a lower priority. I'll handle it, he said. You're a medical officer, she said. You can't treat your own. I can treat my own laceration, he said, with complete factual certainty and no particular emphasis. She looked at him. 10 minutes, she said. He was ready in 7. The serration was dressed correctly. The sleeve had been replaced with a spare from his secondary case. There was no remaining evidence of the incident visible in his presentation, except for a small section of scuffing on his left boot that he had either not noticed or not considered significant. The reception proceeded without incident. The processing cycle concluded successfully the following morning. The post-incident review took 11 days and produced a document of 43 pages, of which 27 addressed the pneumatic seal failure, its causes, and the quality assurance failures that had permitted a microfracture to pass 3 inspection cycles. 7 pages addressed specimen management protocols for multi-unit transfers. 4 pages addressed emergency response team deployment timelines and the coordination gap that had occurred between the containment division and the response unit. 3 pages addressed station personnel safety exposure during the incident window. 2 pages addressed Corporal Eden Voss. The review board had requested the complete personnel file. When it arrived, correctly attached this time, and the board had reviewed the planetary classification on page 4, the lead reviewer had asked for a brief recess that lasted 6 minutes, during which she revised the incident description section of the draft report. The final documents section on Corporal Voss's conduct described it, in the formal language of coalition review documentation, as exceeding operational parameters in a manner consistent with specialized environmental background, and commended his response time, threat assessment accuracy, and post-incident procedural compliance. The section concluded with a single notation that the lead reviewer had added after the recess and had decided, after reading it twice, to keep exactly as she had written it. It read, "Personnel file was incomplete at time of assignment. The missing classification information would not have changed the outcome of the incident. It would, however, have changed the level of preparedness of the personnel who witnessed it, and the incident record suggests that this preparedness gap produced significant observational disruption among station staff who were not expecting to see what they saw. Include the classification next time. There is a category of operational personnel that coalition assignment systems have difficulty classifying correctly, not because the information is unavailable, but because the information, when present, tends to cause requisitioning parties to revise their requests in ways that reflect a misunderstanding of what the classification actually means. Earth's Class 12 designation does not mean that human personnel are in any operational sense compromised. It means the opposite. It means that the baseline environmental conditions under which human physiology, neurology, and behavioral pattern formation occurred included variables that the Coalition's Class 1 through 6 worlds do not produce. It means that the calibration for threat assessment, pain tolerance, situational adaptability, and the specific quality of stillness that comes from spending a formative portion of one's existence in an environment where most of the local ecosystem has opinions about whether you continue to exist. That calibration is different. Not better or worse in the abstract. Different in ways that become apparent in specific situations. Eden Voss had spent 8 years as a trauma medic on coalition postings before the Cathara assignment. He had worked on 3 separate installations that the core operational documentation classified as high-exposure environments. He had done a 2-year rotation on a Dravathi military vessel where the standard operating procedure for a medical officer required comfort with conditions that most coalition medical training programs addressed only theoretically. He had, at various points in his career, been the only medical officer available in situations where the definition of available was doing significant work. He had, twice before, encountered situations involving contained specimens that were no longer contained. Both had been resolved without escalation to emergency response. Both had produced incident reports that, when reviewed by personnel who understood what they were reading, had prompted quiet conversations in assignment offices about how to handle the paperwork correctly. He did not consider any of this unusual. It was the work. It required certain approaches that he had developed over a long period of time in conditions that had been very clear about the consequences of not developing them. He had developed them. He applied them when the situation required it. He was a medical officer. The medical documentation was always accurate and complete. He submitted his own incident report for the Cathara Junction event 40 minutes after the specimens were returned to containment. It was 4 paragraphs. It described the seal failure, the specimen behavior, the restraint application methods used, and the current status of the laceration on his left forearm, which he classified as minor soft tissue injury, non-critical, self-treated, no follow-up required. He did not mention the 12-second evaluation interval. He did not mention what it meant that the primary specimen had spent 12 seconds deciding. He mentioned only the outcome, because the outcome was the relevant data point, and the rest was context that the report did not ask for. Director Ourn read the report twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, more slowly. Then she sat for a moment with the specific quality of stillness that comes from recalibrating something you thought you understood, and finding that the recalibration is larger than anticipated. She had requisitioned a competent medical officer. That was the word she had used. Competent. She was revising it. 3 weeks after the Cathara assignment, the Coalition Assignment Office received a formal communication from Director Vael Ourn's office regarding the Medical Officer Deployment Protocol for Diplomatic Transit Installations. The communication was, by the standards of coalition bureaucratic correspondence, unusually brief. It did not include supporting documentation. It did not reference the post-incident review. It did not recommend specific changes to the requisition form or the transfer documentation process, which would normally be the expected content of a formal communication of this type. It contained 1 paragraph. The paragraph noted that the assignment office's current practice of omitting planetary classification data from transfer documentation on the grounds that the classification was not operationally relevant to the stated requisition criteria had produced a situation at Cathara Transit Station in which approximately 47 personnel had observed an event for which they were entirely unprepared, and that this lack of preparation had generated a secondary disruption to operational function that had, by the time the reception concluded, required 3 separate conversations with delegation representatives and 1 written assurance from Ourn's office that the station was operating within normal parameters. The paragraph then noted that the classification, while not relevant to the requisition criteria, was relevant to the preparation of the people working alongside the assigned personnel, and that this was a distinction the assignment office might wish to consider going forward. The communication closed with a single line, which the assignment officer who received it read twice and then showed to her supervisor, who read it twice, and who then filed it in the Operational Correspondence Archive under a new category that she created specifically for this purpose, and labeled, with a precision she felt the situation warranted, things to be aware of before the fact. The line read, "He was ready in 7 minutes. I had given him 10. I do not think the additional 3 minutes would have changed anything. I am noting this because I think it is relevant. Please include the classification."